North to south, coast to coast, around the world. This is the Wells Report. Greetings, my name is John David Wells. We report the news honestly, truthfully, fairly. We analyze the news for fact and bias. We point out both. I make commentary. That is not the news. That's just my opinion, just as valuable as yours, and that means we debate. News, analysis, commentary, and debate. It's the Wells Report. Glad you're here. There is big news in China. It's interesting. It tells you a little bit about human nature. And we're going to spend some time talking about it here on the Wells Report in this hour. By the way, if you missed the first hour, you didn't miss a thing. That's why it's not there. That's why we talked about Cyber Monday. We had a whole bunch of technical glitches, and I just wrote off the first hour. So today's broadcast is a couple hours, and please forgive me for the mess, okay? So anyway, it's great to have you back. Thanks very much for joining us. Let's see, is it too late to get James Parker back? That's not funny, Dawn. It hurts. That, by the way, is from the chat room, which you can join on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. You can also call me on the telephone at 817-379-2172. Telephone is right there. Operator is standing by. Let's talk a little bit about China. Chaos is rampant in the country of China today, and the reason is because the government has played the COVID... Everybody's laughing at me. China has played the COVID lockdown card one too many times. And even the people of China, who have been essentially rolled over the top of by their government, something we're trying to avoid here in the United States. But they have rolled over their population since Mao Zedong, which is 50s, 60s, so on and so on. And it is a country that essentially just does away with anybody who disagrees with the government. It is totalitarian. And every now and then, people will do things in China that really are epically dangerous. I mean, that's a country of over 1.5 billion people. And so they don't really care much about losing a whole bunch of them. No one has any idea, speaking of Mao Zedong, no one has any idea how many people were killed during the Cultural Revolution. When they got rid of all of the intelligentsia, they got rid of all of their brains, and then found themselves in a place where they really didn't have anything to deal with except archaic technology, and that's how they started rebuilding their country. They started basically from, let's say, 1940 with that technology, and then started building themselves up. And because they had a workforce that would do anything that they were told to do, they were able to essentially undercut the labor costs of every other country on the planet. And that's how China was able to start bringing money into its own country by using that workforce. Well, like I said, they killed off all the intelligentsia, and so they started putting people back in college and sending them to the United States and other places for college educations. And what they ended up with was something called Tiananmen Square. That was a Tiananmen Square uprising where college kids just said this was not the right way to do things, not the right way to run a government or a country, and they started protesting. And that was the last real uprising that we heard anything about, because the government, being totalitarian, runs its own media. Something else we're trying to avoid here in the United States. At least now, the United States media essentially operates to the government interest voluntarily. And it's just as bad, but it is also voluntary, which is why everybody hates the mainstream media, which is why you're here getting the news instead of getting it from the mainstream media. That being said, we have another problem in China. Chaos erupting this weekend because of COVID-19 lockdowns. And this may be COVID-20 or 21 or what have you. But the streets are in chaos. Xi Jinping is tightening his grip on the nation's COVID lockdowns. An expert is warning the end of his leadership could be looming shortly after he just renewed his tenure as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. The author of The Coming Collapse of China, Gordon Chang, joined Fox News, and he was talking about why he believes the current COVID uprisings could signal a political turning point as it pertains to Xi's reign over the country. Here's what Gordon Chang said. This is actually more dangerous than 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre, because then protesters really wanted to keep the Communist Party in place. They just wanted to replace a few hardline leaders. This is more like 1949, when the Chinese people had given up on the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and the communists came in. In other words, this is beginning to look to Gordon Chang like another revolution. That may be where we are. It just shows the nature of what the Chinese people are thinking right now. And the question is, what were you looking for? Let's look for Chinese officials fleeing China, because that could very well be the sign that the end of the Communist Party in China is near. Protests began over the weekend over the country's zero COVID policy. 10 people were burned alive in an apartment in Urumqi, which reportedly was the result of Beijing's hardline COVID restrictions. Like I said, if you're in a situation where you don't agree with the Chinese government, they will just kill you. They will just kill you. There was a story a couple of weeks ago of a woman who was welded into her apartment. They'll just weld your door closed, and she starved to death. Chinese citizens took to the streets shortly afterwards, outraged over the incident. That was the burning down of an apartment building with people inside it. Okay? 10 people gone. Protests in various cities turned a violent corner as police tried to quell the uprisings. Many in the streets called for Xi to step down, demanding the CCP relinquish its leadership. Yeah, this is about trying to throw the communist bums out, to use a term that is used in American politics when the voters just change everybody. Just throw the bums out. Well, now they're trying to throw the communist bums out in China. Gordon Chang warned that China will remain in a state of chaos as the people continue to fight back against the regime. China is going to remain unstable, and if this crisis is quick, the Communist Party won't have a chance to create military misadventure abroad to distract the Chinese people. But this crisis plays out, if it plays out over a long period, Xi Jinping will do just that. He'll lash out, he'll invade somebody, he'll trigger some incident, and the one he's talking about is probably Taiwan. That, of course, will affect us. We have allies and friends in the region: Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Australia. So we're at risk here for what Xi Jinping will probably do if he has the opportunity. Xi Van Fleet, a Maoist Cultural Revolution survivor, echoed Chang's sentiment, calling the uprising in opposition to Xi a huge deal during Fox and Friends this morning. Quote, "I think this is a turning point and people are waking up, especially young people," she said. "I experienced the Cultural Revolution, Mao's dictatorship. For many young people, this was the first time to experience the brutality of communism, and they're waking up, and there was no stop to it. They know that freedom of speech is essential for their survival." It's absolutely true. Freedom of speech is what makes a country free. If there is no freedom of speech, there is no freedom in the country. These people are also forced to stay where they live. They have to have permission to travel the country. Free travel, freedom of speech, liberty, all of these things that apparently the people of the United States are taking for granted. Well, not so much. Van Fleet also unveiled her message to the American people, warning against what she called far-left tendencies that can inhibit American freedoms. Quote, "I just want to say to the American people, don't think this kind of crackdown, this lockdown would not happen here. Many of us argue that it already has, under the same guise. COVID. I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that we live in the United States of America with perhaps the most powerful economy that any nation has ever had in the history of the human endeavor, there may have been messes like this in our streets. I mean, and I'm not talking about BLM stuff. I'm talking about very serious unrest. And it ended for us, at least the COVID part of it, it ended for us relatively quickly. So she says if the left has their way here in the United States, they would not hesitate to do this to us. We need to defend our freedom and never, ever let it go. Now, what is going on around the world with regard to other countries and their reactions? Well, according to Fox News, those reactions are muted. The White House, the U.S. State Department, expressed disagreement with China's zero COVID policy and support for the ongoing protests across the country. We've said that zero COVID is not a policy we're pursuing here, according to a White House National Security Council spokesperson talking to Fox News today. And what we've said, we think it's going to be very difficult for the People's Republic of China to be able to contain this virus through their zero COVID strategy. The comments come as massive protests. The comments come as massive protests have raged across China in recent days, spreading to 20 provinces and the cities of Beijing and Shanghai, with some calling on President Biden to say more in support of the protesters. Lisa Daftari, a foreign policy commentator for Foreign Desk News, drew parallels to the China protests and those still going on in Iran, arguing that people were standing up against corrupt political systems such as communism and theocracy, things that we have so far been able to avoid in the United States. Although there are people currently sitting in the United States government that absolutely believe in socialist communism, totalitarian rule for the United States. How these people got elected in this nation, I have no idea. But some of them have been reelected. AOC's been reelected twice now. Twice. So what are we trying to get done here? Daftari said this. Media got both wrong. The Biden administration is silent. She said that in a Twitter. The protests originated after a deadly apartment building fire last week in Xinjiang, the regional capital of Urumqi, which resulted in 10 people being burned to death as a result of lockdown measures in the city that have been in place for over 100 days. The city's fire department was delayed in arriving on scene, probably because they were told, just stay where you are. Just stay where you are. We want to make an example. Okay. Residents of the city began demonstrating in the streets shortly after the tragedy, marching on government buildings and demanding an end to the city's strict lockdown. Despite the fire happening in the far western region of the country, protests quickly spread across the country, a rare showing of resistance to the Chinese Communist Party. Protesters across the country took to the streets to demand an end to the zero COVID policy that resulted in 3 years of strict lockdowns in many cities. Some protesters called for freedom and democracy. Others called for the removal of President Xi Jinping. Make no mistake, this is a very serious issue. Will it bring down the entire government? I don't know. Could it bring down the entire government? Yes. Yes, it could. So we may be watching the beginning stages of the end of the Chinese Communist Party rule in China. This is the Wells Report. We'll be back with more coming up in just a moment. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Thanks very much for joining us. By the way, if you are familiar with the name Gordon Chang, if that rings a bell, he worked in the National Intelligence Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Defense Department. He appeared before the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He is a guy that has been watching China his whole life, and he is talking about this being a much more difficult uprising than Tiananmen Square, which, by the way, made worldwide news and was one of the first times we'd ever seen, at least in our lifetimes, the Chinese people rise up in anger, which is what they're doing now. The zero COVID policy that they have in China has absolutely run its course, and people are really upset about it. Video from Shanghai, according to Fox News, shows authorities in China attempting to crack down on the protests. One protester was arrested while attempting to give a speech in support of victims while holding up a yellow bouquet of flowers. Other protesters could be seen objecting to the man's arrest as police forced him into a police car. Security clampdowns in the country have helped to temper the protests slightly as of today, though reports from China indicate demonstrations are expected to pick back up in subsequent days. A State Department spokesperson told Fox News Digital the U.S. supports the right of peaceful protesters throughout the world. The spokesperson said, quote, "We've long said that everybody has the right to peacefully protest in the United States and around the world. This includes the People's Republic of China." The protesters garnered some support from the United Kingdom. The British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly called on the Chinese government to respect the rights of demonstrators and journalists after a BBC journalist was arrested in China. Media freedom and the freedom to protest must be respected. No country is exempt, Cleverly said on Twitter today. The result of the arrest of BBC journalist E.P. Lawrence in China is deeply disturbing. Journalists must be able to do their jobs without intimidation. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres would not comment on China's COVID policies, but called on authorities to respect the protesters. We've seen some of the video demonstrations. Our reaction is the same one we have for the world over, is that we believe in the importance of people's right to peaceful assembly and to be able to redress their grievances and association too, and their rights to demonstrate peacefully and urge authorities to guarantee that right. Well, okay. So once again, China is in unrest right now, and we will see what happens as the days continue. And so the world is sort of looking at this cautiously. The world leaders are saying to themselves, hey, we're going to make these rather what I consider to be weak gestures of support for these protesters. And if they're weak enough, then the Chinese Communist Party will win again. Let's see, looking at the chat room, Jesse says, what? You're saying the Chinese people are finally realizing that communism doesn't work? Yeah. Ginny says, thank goodness we don't live in China. Well, I'm trying to keep us from having to live in a country just like China because I think some of the politicians in the United States think that's a great idea. Jess says, I wish the American people would wake up and see how bad communism can get. Let's see, Gary points out that things in Australia are not good. That's true. And once again, we are in a position where we are seeing exactly what's going on happening in countries that essentially didn't align with China. They aligned with us. Now what they're doing in Australia is essentially subjugating the people for whatever reason. Let's see what else. It's disturbing. AOC and Omar got reelected. Young, Waters, and Pelosi. Okay. Let's see. I don't know about Waters. I think she's talking about Waters World. There's a link under the American Foreign Council policy called China Reform Monitor that has daily news about what's going on. Thanks, Gary. And so there you go. China is in trouble. What's next? Well, we'll cover it here in just a couple of moments. There is an interesting little thing going on about that I'll get to next. This is the Wells Report. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Our telephone number is 817-379-2172. 817-379-2172. Join us if you'd like to. You can join us on the chat, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. Everybody's there. Thanks very much for being with us today. I sincerely appreciate it. Eddie said something that was very good. If we're hearing anything at all coming out of China that's negative, it must be really bad. And he's really correct. We'll keep our eye on that story because there may be more developments today. We'll let you know. Okay, so by the way, Anne points out that Australia just took away the guns from weapons from their people. And that's when the police started beating people in the streets. And that's what's happening in Australia these days. I don't know why, but it's something that we also need to keep our eyes on. Something else we need to keep our eyes on is something that I've talked about for a long time on this broadcast. And that is there's only one thing worse than a politician in Washington, D.C., and that is a lame duck politician in Washington, D.C. When we have an election, there are people that will lose their jobs. It's just part of it. And those people losing their jobs become people that are, because they're looking at the end of their political career, in most cases, they are willing to vote for things that people of the United States may not necessarily be very interested in. And there are a lot of those things that are happening right now. Congress is back in business for this lame duck session. And there was a very serious change of power, not as serious as people thought it was going to be, but there's a very serious change of power happening in Washington, D.C. The Republicans will take charge of the House of Representatives. And therefore, the Democrats are trying to get as many things passed in this last session of Congress before that power change. And there are a lot of very serious controversial issues and bills that are going to extend into December and possibly past Christmas. The House and Senate will return this week from Thanksgiving break. They're here. They're grappling with a whole bunch of priorities, including a same-sex marriage act, electoral reform, military spending, as well as government spending. This is also something that proves the incompetence of our government. They are once again up against the debt limit. They're once again trying to figure out how they're going to keep the government from having the money it needs or the money that it thinks it has to continue their businesses and various pursuits. The problem with this is that these people that normally wouldn't vote for such things will probably vote for such things because what have they got to lose? A continuing resolution, it's a temporary spending bill that allowed the federal government to keep operating while Congress worked on a full-time funding bill, will expire on the 16th of December. We've seen this time and time and time again. What they do is they wait till the last second to be able to do all this, and then they rush it through. And they rush it through and continue to perpetuate what has led to $31.8 trillion in national debt. I haven't checked on it. It goes up so fast and so quickly, which is the same thing. Anyway, it goes up so fast, it's hard to keep track of. But that continuing resolution is going to expire. Congress has to pass legislation to keep the government operating past that date or risk a government shutdown, which, as we all know, since we've been through this time and time and time again, is not really a shutdown. It just saves us money we shouldn't be spending in the first place. Lawmakers are considering an extension of the continuing resolution to December 23rd, which would give them more time to negotiate a funding bill for the full fiscal year that began October 1st and runs through September 30th. If they can't reach that agreement, it's possible that it's going to get pushed to the next Congress. Republicans who have different spending priorities would have a narrow majority in the House. Democrats would have a narrow majority in the Senate. The Pentagon, they say, hey, we have to have our military funded. The lame duck session raises concern among the top brass in the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is warning Congress, as he did in December of 2021, that anything short of a year-long deal to fund the government would cause significant harm to national security. Quote, We can't outcompete China with our hands tied behind our back 3, 4, 5, or 6 months of every fiscal year. He said that in a letter to the House and Senate leaders. Austin was referring to the National Defense Authorization Act, which covers service members' pay, veterans' care, combat vehicles, aircraft, ships, and more. House lawmakers passed their version of the act in July. The Senate is still considering the legislation. The Ukraine budget, the Ukraine aid, is also in the crosshairs. And this, by the way, also proves even more incompetence because as we're paying Ukraine, all this money that is not treaty obligated, as we're spending all this money in Ukraine, money that we have treaty obligations to spend in Taiwan is not being spent. That money is lagging. Taiwan needs it. And with the current unrest in China, there could be there could be no better time for Xi Jinping to go ahead and invade Taiwan to distract his people from the fact that they are doing this COVID lockdown. And if you don't cooperate, they'll just set fire to the building you're living in, which apparently is what caused all these protests in China to begin with. And now we're sitting here having trouble getting Taiwan its treaty obligated military stuff because we're sending it to Ukraine. We can't chew gum and walk at the same time. Yeah, this is a big deal. One of the sticking points with government funding is from House Republicans. They want to tighten the purse strings on Ukraine aid. They've been asking the Pentagon for a detailed weapons list sent to Ukraine. President Joe Biden is asking for $37 billion more for Ukraine in military and economic aid. House Republicans, including Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who was in line to be the next speaker, but that's up in the air, also want the National Defense Authorization Act to be delayed until the next Congress when they'd have more power to address what McCarthy has described as a woke Pentagon. The increased scrutiny in Ukraine, largely driven by the far-right flank of the caucus, and is one of the ways those members are influencing legislation. McCarthy, who said he does not want a blank check for the war-torn U.S. ally. First of all, Ukraine is not a U.S. ally. We have no treaty obligations with Ukraine at all. I don't know why we're doing this, except, of course, there have been some pretty serious deals while President Biden was Vice President Biden that were cut in Ukraine, and maybe that explains why this, from what we understand from both sides of the political aisle, is a very corrupt country. And yet the Democrats are pouring billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of dollars into it. Can someone explain this to me? Because it looks a lot like, well, kind of a political payoff to me. And that's a pretty serious charge that I'm making against the current president. Is that the case? And of course, I don't have to say anything about the money that was spent on the Biden family from China. But that seems to have been a good investment as well. Once again, I'm not saying that this is happening. What I'm saying is it looks like it's happening. Isn't that bad enough? Anyway, the blank check is off the table for the Republicans, apparently. Texas GOP Republican Michael McCaul, who is set to chair the Foreign Relations Committee in the next Congress, said he thinks some have misinterpreted what McCarthy was saying. He was basically saying we're not going to write a blank check. We're going to have oversight and accountability. And that's why the committee that he's set to be the chairman of, the Foreign Relations Committee, will be taking a very hard look at that money. I think taxpayers deserve that transparency. But that doesn't mean that we're going to cut and run on Ukrainians who have proven themselves to be effective far more than our Department of Defense and State Department realized. Other issues include codifying same-sex marriage. Senate lawmakers are on track to pass same-sex marriage rights as early as this week, a move taken as a preventative measure against a right-leaning Supreme Court that earlier this year rolled back federal abortion rights and has hinted it won't honor precedent on earlier high court decisions, including gay marriage. Okay. Once again, what happened with Roe v. Wade was the Supreme Court of the United States realizing that the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision overstepped the checks and balances of the government of the United States as prescribed by the Constitution. They fixed it. There are other quote unquote rights that were created by guys sitting in a beautiful chamber in black robes, as opposed to people that are elected to do that. Now, the Democrats say they're going to codify all these things. That's fine. If they can do it, that's fine. But they need to remember something about this so-called Marriage Equality Act. What they have to keep in mind is that this got passed in California twice. And it was turned aside in state referendums twice. And the Supreme Court, another group of black-robed individuals, not elected, sitting in the California Supreme Court, turned those votes aside twice. They need to remember that not everybody in the world believes that there should be marriage as a blanket term. From a legal standpoint, that is the establishment of a religion, a governmental religion. And that is specifically prohibited by the First Amendment of the United States. Because marriage is a religious ceremony. It has to do with religion. Civil unions, on the other hand, wide open. Absolutely wide open. By all means, do a civil ceremony. That is a way that you can essentially have your cake and eat it too. But for some reason, the LGBTQ plus community believes that they have got to have marriage like everybody else. Well, that runs afoul of if not all of the major religions. And once again, the government interfering with religion is specifically prohibited by the Constitution. This is an unconstitutional move. And I think that's what the Supreme Court is going to look at and say, this is unconstitutional. Now, that takes us back to the politics. That takes us back to this particular same-sex marriage codification. And that's fine. If you can do that, that's fine. That's why we have a political process. If the people want this, that's fine. But the people have shown, even the people in California have shown that they don't want this. There needs to be a separation of church and state. And marriage is that bridge. That bridges church and state, especially when it's codified by the Congress. Meanwhile, they could solve the whole problem by just saying, sure, go down to the courthouse and get married. There will be churches that have no problem whatsoever extending marriage, which is a religious institution, to people who fit outside the strict precepts and strict understandings of biblically based religions. There are people that will do it. Okay. But once again, that's not the government doing it. Religions, churches, are private entities. So it's not that these evil Republicans and their conservative gobbledygookian stuff are trying to take away a right that was given to them by the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court cannot enact a right. That has to be done through Congress. That has to be a constitutional amendment. And they know all this. But the mainstream media, this is USA Today that we're dealing with here, they want to continue this idea that these rights can be cobbled up by the judicial branch, and they cannot be. Now, I've said this a lot, and I'm trying to figure out why people aren't reporting it properly. This is not some crusade against the LGBTQ community. That is not what's going on here. It is a return to the actual constitutional operation of the government of the United States, judicial, legislative, and executive. And that's what it is. That's what it is. The Respect for Marriage Act could indeed pass this week and codify a 2015 Supreme Court ruling that made same-sex marriage legal nationwide. Not the job of the Supreme Court. If it passes the Senate, it could go to the House. That version has already been passed. There'll be a conference committee that will reconcile the two bills, etc. There is then electoral reform and gun safety. These are bills that are pending in this lame duck session. What about those? We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up in just a couple of moments. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Our telephone number, 817-379-2172. 817-379-2172. The only thing more dangerous in Washington, D.C. than a politician is a lame duck politician. What will they pass? What will be defeated? We'll find out, and we'll continue this in just a couple of moments. This is the Wells Report. Thanks very much for watching. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. You can join us on the chat room, although you might want to wait a few minutes. There's a Thanksgiving pie recipe being discussed that I've never seen before, and I don't really want to. The lame duck session of Congress is going on. USA Today is reporting on it. Majority Whip of the U.S. House of Representatives, Democrat James Clyburn, wants to use the House Democrats' remaining days in power to what they say is protect voting and elections. During a Sunday interview on Face the Nation, he emphasized the need for both the John R. Lewis Voting Act and the Electoral College Reform Act. These are two fundamental. These are two things fundamental to our democracy. We need to keep them in the forefront. You keep the government open, but let's also keep fundamental rights protected. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act would restore protections against discrimination in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and would come after restrictive laws targeting voters of color that have been passed in 21 states, according to a tally by the Brennan Center for Justice. The only problem with that is that record voting was seen throughout all of the various demographic groups, including voters of color, in the last election. There's no reason to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. As a matter of fact, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for all intents and purposes, federalized state elections because the federal government usurped the idea that there was bigotry going on in 1965, which, by the way, was the case. But what happened is that anybody that tried to pass any kind of voting right law had to get a sign-off from the federal government. That is not the way federalism works. It's up to the states to decide these things. And once again, this may be basic, and it may be something that you look at and go, but everybody knows that. Well, everybody may know it, but there aren't enough people supporting it. The Constitution of the United States protects us from this government. Is that something that you think might be a good idea, especially now? I sure do. That's just my opinion. So once again, by the way, the Supreme Court turned aside, before the Donald Trump appointees, turned aside many of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, rights extended by the federal government, the judicial branch, to the rest of the federal government, which violated the Constitution. The other one is the Electoral College Reform Act, which would modernize the 1887 law that former President Donald Trump tried to utilize in his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, a piece of legislation some lawmakers see as more prescient after Trump declared his candidacy for 2024. Now, that's a biased paragraph. That's biased. USA Today is biased. The Electoral College Reform Act is also another law that does not need to be passed. It does not need to be passed. It is a waste of time. Clyburn said those were the top issues. Also, gun safety laws are a close third. Okay. Let's see. Despite recent mass shootings, it's unlikely a 50-50 Senate would be able to galvanize 60 votes needed to pass gun reform. President Biden last week called for an assault weapons ban. Quote, "Let's get rid of assault weapons," unquote. The idea that we'll allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. Just sick. He said on Thanksgiving Day, "I'm going to try to get rid of assault weapons." There's a big difference between what are called assault weapons and semi-automatic weapons. Semi-automatic weapons reload themselves after every shot. There are a lot of weapons out there that are not what are called assault rifles. They are not actually assault rifles. They are rifles that are simply semi-automatic. And listen to what he's saying. The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. What are you going to do? You're going to get rid of all the police automatics? We're going to go back to single shot? Is that what you're talking about, Mr. President? The answer is no. And that one is so out of kilter that even a Democrat senator said that's going nowhere. That's in the news today. And so once again, these are laws that only a lame duck Congress would even consider, which is why it's dangerous to have lame duck sessions. You know, I don't know exactly how you would fix that aside from calling for a moratorium on anything except, shall we say, budget bills or bills that don't affect the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States. And I'm talking about the 10th Amendment, which reserved for the states things that the Constitution forbade the federal government from enacting. When I'm talking about this, it's essential that we keep this going because that's how the United States works. We do not want an overarching federal government. These United States is what makes up this country. These United States make up this country. We want to keep it that way. We don't want the federal government coming to any state of the union and dictating terms as if they could. That's not the way the United States works. It's not the way the United States works. So we'll see. What will happen with some of these? I don't know. Let's see, don't know why they call it a lame duck, because they're still in power. Well, because they don't have the need to reelect themselves. They've been diselected. And so they'll vote whichever way they want to. That's why it's dangerous. This is the Wells Report. Back with hour number 3 in just a moment. Yeah, lame duck sessions. We're going to have to stop passing anything meaningful in lame duck sessions. That's what I'm thinking. North to south, coast to coast, around the world. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Here, we report the news honestly, fairly. We analyze the news for fact and bias. We point it out when we find them. And it. I make commentary, which is not the news. It leads to debate. My commentary is just my opinion. You have your opinion, equally valuable, so share yours, by all means. Call on the telephone at 817-379-2172, 817-379-2172, or you can join us on the chat room. It's available on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. I hope you had a wonderful and fantastic Thanksgiving weekend, and I hope you, if you're taking today off, congratulations. Good for you. We were talking last hour about a couple of bills because there's a lame duck Congress going on, and it's dangerous and it's crazy because politicians do dangerous and crazy things when they don't have to worry about being reelected. A lot of Democrats lost their jobs, and therefore the Democrats still control the Congress. Do we need to do something about that sometime? Probably. We need to get rid of lame duck sessions. In other words, essentially all you can pass would be budgetary items, etc. And even those, kind of cause my brow to furrow a bit. But the idea that people not beholden to the public would be able to pass any law really kind of concerns me. But that's the case. One of the laws that they are considering is this assault weapons ban. The assault weapons ban was passed mostly by Democrats in the House of Representatives already, but it's been sitting there because the Senate doesn't have the votes to pass it, which is another reason why the Democrat Party has been working so hard at trying to get rid of the Senate rule that requires a 60-vote margin to pass anything non-budgetary. So this is a situation that is meant to be in place so that the minority party does have a say in legislation. If, say, for example, you have the House of Representatives, which is essentially majority rules, and you have another House of Congress like the Senate, where there has to be a 60-vote margin to be able to pass anything that's non-budgetary, then the minority party, regardless of what party it is, does have a say in legislation. That Senate rule is essential to the way our government works. There's no reason to turn the Senate of the United States into a majority rule circumstance. The only reason the Democrats are trying to do that is because they don't want the minority party, which would be the Republican Party, to have any say in any legislation whatsoever. And all you have to do to see that as being true is watch the legislative stylings for the last 2 years, where Democrats own both houses of Congress. And so Senator Chris Murphy, who, by the way, is a Democrat from Connecticut, threw cold water on President Biden's hopes to pass this assault weapons ban during the lame duck Congress. Now, Senator Murphy I really don't know much about him, but you can draw your own conclusions here. But he is pointing out that the Senate doesn't have 60 votes to pass this thing, and nor should it. And it is my suspicion, strong suspicion, that it's not going anywhere. Senator Murphy said that the votes for such a bill are not there for Democrats, despite the president's push to enact a ban following a spate of shootings in recent weeks. The 50-50 split in Congress means Democrats would need 10 additional Republicans to defect and vote for the ban in order to become a filibuster, or to overcome a filibuster. Quote, this is where Murphy kind of covers his political backside. Quote, I'm glad President Biden is going to be pushing us to take a vote on an assault weapons ban. The House has already passed it. It's sitting in front of the Senate. Does it have 60 votes in the Senate right now? Probably not. But let's see if we can try to get that number as close to 60 as possible. If we don't have the votes, then we'll talk to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and maybe come back next year with perhaps an additional senator and see if we can do better. One senator is not going to make the difference. It's not. Biden first called for an assault weapons ban following the shooting of the Club Q nightclub in Colorado earlier this month. The suspect in that case, who described himself as non-binary, is accused of using an AR-15 style rifle to murder 5 people at the LGBTQ nightclub, that LGBTQ plus community he is a part of. Quote, gun violence continues to have a devastating and particular impact on LGBTQ plus communities across our nation, and threats of violence are increasing. We saw it 6 years ago in Orlando when our nation suffered the deadliest attack following the LGBTQ plus community in American history. We must address the public health epidemic of gun violence in all of its forms. Earlier this year, I signed the most significant gun safety law in nearly 3 decades, in addition to taking other historic actions. But we must do more. We must enact an assault weapons ban to get weapons of war off of American streets. They're not weapons of war. Those weapons are completely different. That they look the same has nothing to do with how they function. It is not something that we, the people of the United States, want to see happen. And remember, the president said the quiet part out loud. It's not these so-called assault weapons. It's semi-automatic weapons. And the only people that would then have semi-automatic weapons or weapons of war would be people that worked for the government. In other words, police departments and the military. You see, the Democrat Party doesn't have any problems with weapons of war on the streets. After the January 6th mess, they put 26,000 U.S. soldiers armed with real weapons of war around the Capitol building to what? Who are they going to shoot? With real weapons of war, real M16s, not AR-15s. Who are they going to shoot? They were going to shoot us. Were they going to shoot us because we were breaking in through the razor wire and fencing around the Capitol with troops inside that perimeter? You know, you got to look at this for what it actually is. You have a group of people that are running the government, that are politicians supposedly elected by us, protecting themselves with soldiers, razor wire, and fencing. Now, you can say what you want about the January 6th riot. You can say anything you want to. Was it stupid? Absolutely. Was it ridiculous and unnecessary and foolhardy? Absolutely, absolutely, and absolutely. But was it some American revolution that required 26,000 National Guard troops? Absolutely not. Look, you can't turn your back on this government. We cannot turn our back on this government. Likewise, we cannot allow this government to infringe on a right that keeps it possible for us to not have to worry about the federal government doing the things they're doing in Australia. No thanks. I'm fine. I know that there's gun violence. It's not an epidemic, because if it was an epidemic, then Chicago wouldn't be, a shooting gallery, which is what it is. And by the way, imposing defenselessness on law-abiding citizens is not the way to solve gun violence. It's the way to ensure gun violence, and lots of it. Because nobody cares, Mr. President, whether anybody that would break the law in the first place doesn't care whether you pass this law. The only people that care are law-abiding citizens. And therefore, you're going after the wrong people. And then when you have the entire party, the Democrat Party, seemingly in lockstep behind the idea that the real problem with crime in the United States isn't the criminal, it's the law that defines them as criminals when they break that law. Once again, there are far more law-abiding citizens in the United States than there are non-law-abiding citizens. You're going after the wrong people. And that's why the problem still remains. Because you're not doing the things that are necessary to actually stop it. Use a gun in the commission of a crime, you go to jail for life. Are we doing that? No. Did we used to do that? Yeah, but it was unfair. Unfair to who? Unfair to criminals? Yeah, unfair to criminals. All I did was use a gun. Yeah, exactly. Bye-bye now. See you for you're gone forever. That would stop all of this. But once again, when you have a political party that is aligned behind the idea that the problem with law enforcement in the United States is law enforcement as opposed to the criminals they're enforcing the laws on, well, you can't allow anything to disarm the people of the United States more than they already are disarmed. Mostly by choice. People don't have to buy assault weapons or what are called assault weapons. They don't have to buy those. They do it because they feel like the government wants to take them away, and so they purchase them, which is smart. No, that bill isn't going anywhere. Weapons of war. Biden reiterated his push on Thanksgiving Day, although appeared to conflate assault weapons with semi-automatic weapons, which make up the large swath of rifle, handgun, and shotgun purchases in the U.S. A semi-automatic weapon automatically reloads each shot, but only fires one round for each trigger pull. Yeah, you see, the president screwed up again because he's want to do that. The entire idea behind all of this is to rid law-abiding citizens from being able to have a semi-automatic weapon. He did not appear to conflate it. He did conflate it. He's the president of the United States. The mainstream media, in its effort to translate for the president of the United States, they're missing what he's saying in their effort to clean up his messes. Don't clean up his messes. Report them as they stand. Report them as they are. That's essential. Biden went on to say the idea that we allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick, just sick. I'm going to try to get rid of assault weapons. Well, okay, let's go ahead and play this out. So you go ahead and get rid of assault weapons. Now that we've all breached the idea of it's all actually semi-automatic weapons we have to get rid of, that's the next step. No, Mr. President. No. The Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms, not muskets, not hunting rifles, arms, is there for a reason. It's there to stop you from doing the things you want to do with the people of the United States. We won't have it. If you want to stop gun violence, start doing something to the perpetrators of gun violence, not to the people that are trying to defend themselves. See, a constitution, a constitution is essential to keep this government out of our very houses. This government is trying to declare war on the people of the United States. In order to do so, they have to make sure that they are disarmed. And if a soldier is carrying it, I'm sorry, I think I should be able to carry it, which was when the Second Amendment was put together in the first place. This is the Wells Report. Back in a moment. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Our telephone number is 817-379-2172. 817-379-2172. Criminals with guns are the people that create gun violence. And there is no better place to report on that level of gun violence than Chicago. And they had another Chicago weekend. Just because it was Thanksgiving didn't mean that the rifle range was closed or the weapons range was closed. Gun violence in Chicago continued during the holiday weekend. It occurred between 6 p.m. Friday and 11:59 p.m. Sunday, according to Chicago police data released this morning. There were 24 reported shooting incidents and 31 shooting victims, which included at least 4 juveniles. People said 6 people were murdered in weekend violence. The fatal shootings included a 42-year-old woman who was walking with a 14-year-old boy through a vacant lot in the 2300 block of East 100th Street just before 8:30 p.m. on Friday. A black SUV drove up to the victims and began firing shots at them, according to police. Cops said the woman was shot in the hip and later died at the hospital. The boy was shot in the shoulder and hospitalized in good condition. No arrests have been made in the shootings. That's the problem. That's the problem. That's the problem. If I was the mayor of Chicago, what I'd be doing is I'd be working on crafting a law that said if you used a weapon in the commission of a crime, then it would automatically add 25 years to whatever sentence that you had, whatever sentence of the crime that you were guilty of. Proven guilty by a jury of your peers. Or life imprisonment, which I think is just as effective and probably just as needed. There's a solution for you. Stop going after people who follow the law and try to infringe on their ways to defend themselves. Start going after the criminals. A woman gets shot in the hip, the boy gets shot in the shoulder, no arrests have been made. That's the problem. But of course, when you have a political party that says the police are actually the problem and the laws are actually the problem, the criminals are just misunderstood, well, there you go. Also killed over the weekend, 2 men, aged 34 and 36, both shot in the head at a gathering at the 12700 block of South Halsted just after midnight on Saturday. Police said a 60-year-old man was killed when he and a known male got into a verbal altercation at a home in the 7800 block of St. Honoré at 3:40 a.m. on Saturday. The man was shot in the chest, stomach, and right thigh. The suspect was said to have dropped the handgun at the scene and fled. No arrests have been made. The wounded included 2 boys, 16 and 13, inside a car parked on a street at the 11300 block of South May Street around 5:50 p.m. on Saturday. An unknown offender approached and opened fire. The boy was struck in the right arm. The younger boy was hit in the left hand. Both were hospitalized in good condition. What's the next sentence? You know what it is. No arrests were made. Last weekend, there were 15 shooting incidents, 20 shooting victims, and 3 murders. I'll tell you what, let's start working on curtailing the rights of criminals to just shoot people when they feel like it, instead of trying to stop people who are law-obeying people from defending themselves. It is the exact absurd, perverse stupidity of statements like the president made. Mr. President, start working to get these people off the street and stop trying to infringe on the rights of we, the people of the United States. And if you can't get that done, for God's sakes, resign. I mean, stop it. This is the Wells Report. We'll be back with more in just a moment. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Thanks very much for watching today. I appreciate it. If you'd like to support the report, please do so. Share it with your friends. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a like. Those matter. They really do. Subscribe to the broadcast on whatever platform you watch. Subscribe. That way we can show people that are important to bring money into the show that we have lots of people watching. And that would be helpful. And speaking of money into the show, if you'd like to support the show financially, you can. Here's what you do. You go to patreon.com/The Wells Report, patreon.com/The Wells Report, and throw me a buck or two. That would be nice. I'd appreciate that very much. It would be very, very nice for you to do that. Let's see here. I've got okay. Add to block list. Got that all handled. Every now and then we get very weird messages on our chat room. I get rid of them as quickly as I possibly can. And I appreciate, by the way, that if you see one and you can, by all means, get rid of them. So anyway, the chat room is available if you'd like to debate. And if you'd like to have your comments heard, I'd like to hear that too. So let's talk a little bit about what is next in politics so we can finish up our politics for the day. Can't turn your back on this government. You just can't. And it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating. But there is something that you need to be aware of, especially if you happen to be a follower of the Republican Party, something I hope to iron out of you one of these days. Because the problem isn't the Republican Party. The problem, may be the Democrat Party, but the problem is politicians. Politics is a coin. There's the right side of the coin and the left side of the coin, but it's still one coin. And these people work together to essentially operate in spite of the American people, and I'm tired of it. How about you? I am. So there are 5 House Republicans that are on the record with their opposition to Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's bid to become Speaker when the party takes control in January. The high-profile defections have raised questions about whether Kevin McCarthy, the Republican from California, will have the votes necessary to clinch the position on the floor of the House. I doubt very sincerely that these people will stand in the way of Kevin McCarthy being the Speaker, but this is significant. It is. 218 votes are needed to elect a Speaker when the Congress assembles on January 3rd. McCarthy's margin is significantly narrow. The GOP is expected to wind up with a 222-seat majority in January, compared to 213 seats for Democrats. All 435 members of the House are present and voting for the Speaker in January. McCarthy can lose no more than 4 Republican votes, and there are 5 Republicans on the record as opposing Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. By the way, there are others that are on the fence. House Republicans need a leader with credibility across every spectrum of the GOP conference in order to be a capable fighting force for the American people, said Representative Matt Gaetz, or Gates. That person is not Kevin McCarthy. That guy has a lot of power in Washington, D.C., insofar as everybody, Republicans included, were doing their best to try to get Mr. Gates out of power. And so he won that election. And so he has absolutely no fealty, or shall we say loyalty, to Kevin McCarthy. Well, who's the alternative? I don't know. There are probably a bunch of them. Gates, along with GOP Representative Ralph Norman of South Carolina, Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, are seen as hard-nosed to McCarthy. Regardless of the concessions offered, the 3 are unlikely to vote for the Californians' ascension to Speaker. 2 other Republicans, Bob Good of Virginia, Matt Rosendale of Montana, have also voiced their opposition publicly. Both lawmakers have not explicitly ruled out voting for McCarthy in exchange for concessions on House rules. Both men have said such concessions would have to be large to quell the reservations. At the moment, conservative hardliners like Good and Rosendale want to decentralize the Speaker's power over committees and the way legislation moves through the House. Why is that? It doesn't have anything to do with the speakership. It has to do with what happens when Republicans work at cross purposes to the American people. Who am I referring to? Mitch McConnell of the United States Senate. Mitch McConnell is not someone who is adversarial to the Democrat Party. He wants to negotiate with the Democrat Party. We don't need a negotiator. We need somebody standing up for a constitutionally based set of laws coming out of Washington, D.C. That's not Mitch McConnell. The people of the House, they don't want to create that same kind of, shall we say, fiefdom that the Senate Republicans have to deal with Mitch McConnell. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get somebody that's actually interested in doing the things that are required by the Republican Party to clean up Washington. And I'm not sure that Kevin McCarthy is the right guy either, but like I said, he's going to end up being the speaker. But that being said, we don't need more Republicans in the Republican Party. We need more Americans in the Republican Party. For that matter, we need more Americans in the Democrat Party. I wonder if there are any left. I wonder. I don't know. So each member of Congress has earned and deserves equal participation in the legislative process, says Rosendale. McCarthy has already agreed to some of the demands by changing the makeup of the internal GOP steering committee, which decides committee assignments, to empower rank-and-file members. The California Republican is also expected to support requirements that legislation move through the committee process and receive extensive debate before being brought to the House floor for a vote. Kevin McCarthy knows when the time is right to strike a deal, an aide to the GOP leadership said. This is all public negotiation going on right now. McCarthy did not respond to Fox News for any kind of comment. The Republican Party is the adversary, or should be the adversary, of Democrat policy initiatives. One of the things that we've learned in 2 years of single party rule is that the actual single party, while damaging, is also joined by a whole bunch of crazy people all throughout government that is more damaging. I mean, we have open bigotry against white people in the United States right now that is suffused throughout the Democrat administration. We've reported on it on this broadcast. And so why is it that we don't have these things or still have to deal with these things? Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe because we don't have enough leadership in the Republican Party to be able to stop this stuff cold. You see, the Republican Party has to actually man up. And that includes everybody of every gender. Okay? Both of them. They need to man up. They need to say, nope, not doing that. Not going to happen. Absolutely not. And they need to be able to do that when it's not politically savvy. They need to do it because it's the right thing to do. The Republican Party doesn't do that. And that is the single most important thing that has to get fixed with the Republican Party immediately. The Democrat Party does not give a damn about the American people. I'm not saying the Republican Party should do that. What I'm saying is that while the Democrat Party doesn't care what the American people want, only their gang of leftists with big clubs that will swing at their heads if they don't do exactly what the left wants them to do, what we need to do is we need to have Republicans stand up to that because Democrats won't. And we know it. We've seen it. I keep telling you that the only thing we can do is to take conservative politics away from the Republican Party. And there's only one guy right now that can do that, and that's Donald Trump. The Republican Party is trying to flush him down the toilet even as we speak. Why would he care one way or another about the Republican Party? For that matter, if you're a Republican, and I'm asking this seriously, this is not a rhetorical question. Why do you support the Republican Party? I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious. I don't know why people support the Republican Party. They don't do anything except negotiate with Democrats on Democrat Party initiatives. Okay, so what are we doing here? We've got one political party, the Democrat Party, threatening us. And then we've got the other Republican Party, the Republican Party, the other political party, ignoring us. That's not the way the government of the United States is supposed to work. And we are responsible with our votes. We're responsible. Now, I understand what people say. Well, John David, gosh, if President Trump decides to run as the presidential candidate of the Conservative Party, then the Democrats will win. There are two things to that. That's not necessarily the way it goes. Theodore Roosevelt was elected as a third-party candidate. The other thing about it is, since we're going to be abused with Democrat policy anyway, just because it's watered down thanks to the hard work of dedicated Republicans as opposed to simply defeated, watering it down doesn't do any good. It just takes a little longer. I'm talking about stopping these people cold. I'm saying that every time some Democrat policy initiative comes before any House or Senate committee and or body for a vote, that when it is plainly and clearly unconstitutional, someone needs to stand up and say that violates your oath of office. And here is a copy of the Constitution of the United States and hand it to them. Which brings me to something else. Over the weekend on Twitter, people are making fun of the fact that the Republican Party is going to read the Constitution as one of its first acts. They're saying it's political theater. It's not political theater. It is a reminder of what that oath means. And I said on Twitter, it's quite likely that will be the first time any sitting member of Congress, many sitting members of Congress, have ever actually read the Constitution of the United States or even heard it. It's 4 pages. It's the most brilliant government charter in the history of the human endeavor. And both political parties ignore it for their particular politics. And it's dangerous. And it's absolutely ridiculous that we even have to have this conversation. They take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and then they completely ignore it. As a matter of fact, Dianne Feinstein once said, our job is to not pass constitutional law. Our job is to pass whatever law we think is necessary. Oh, really? Well, what about that oath? Excuse me, as she walks away. I'm sorry, I just don't see that as a long-term solution to anything. In fact, I see it as a long-term plan to destroy everything. That's what I see. My opinion. But the Republican Party, now they're trying to figure out exactly what they're going to do, from a standpoint of the Speaker of the House. I mean, somebody said, well, what's the alternative? Well, how about Jim Jordan? How about Jim Jordan? I think he'd make a fine Speaker of the House. There are a lot of people that could do it. That's what I believe should happen. By the way, Yvonne says, regarding third-party candidates, since Perot ran, both parties have put many roadblocks in place to make it impossible for a third-party candidate to even get recognized. Yeah, I understand that. But 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. I'm pretty sure that the same number or close to the same number would vote for him again, regardless of the party that he's involved with. Once again, there's a real chance for the United States to change things for the better. Can you imagine? Think about this for a moment. Just think about this. Little thought experiment. How would our country be different if there was a political party that stood for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? at every turn and use that as a litmus test for yes and no votes. Would the country be better or would the country be worse? I think the country would be much better. If you don't think it would be better, by all means explain it. Buddy said that Perot drained off votes from the Republican candidate. That's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. Would Donald Trump do that? I don't think so. Donald Trump is too big to ignore. And yes, that's how we got President Clinton, the last Democrat president. This is the Wells Report. Back with more in just a moment. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Gary was just talking about how Ross Perot ended up taking out George H.W. Bush in his second term because Bill Clinton got elected. And and then he comes back with, oh, Clinton getting to be president. My bad. I voted for Perot. Sorry, won't happen again. No, it probably won't. Because Ross Perot is no longer with us. God rest his soul. That's funny. That is so funny. Speaking of funny, Elon Musk is having a great time with Twitter and the left's meltdown of his acquisition of same. It is truly, truly entertaining. He has caused the latest flurry on social media after the tech CEO posted a meme mocking CNN's concerns about free speech on Twitter. He posted a picture of CNN's Don Lemon alongside a satirical chyron. That's a little message. If you look down here on the screen, those are chyrons. Okay? Those right there, those are chyrons. Those are lower thirds, actually. Anyway, the chyron said this. Elon Musk could threaten. Take two. Elon Musk could threaten free. See, you can't say threaten and free at the same time. Elon Musk could threaten free speech on Twitter by allowing people to speak freely. It's great. Some Twitter users were confused as whether the meme was from an actual CNN broadcast. The image was originally from Geniuses Times, a satirical website that describes itself as the most reliable source of fake news in the planet. Actually, the most reliable sources of fake news are ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and a host of others, MSNBC, for example. Anyway, that's just an aside, in my opinion. Musk's post prompted a wide range of responses: conservative praise, liberal meltdown. Ronald Brownstein, a senior editor at The Atlantic, claimed that Musk was simply repackaging hate speech as free speech to empower extremism on the far right. Yeah. Simple equation. Musk repackages hate speech, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and far-right intimidation as free speech in any effort to hold him accountable for injecting it into U.S. society as the woke mob. On both ends, the same goal: amplifying and empowering far-right extremists. Well, Mr. Brownstein, let me explain something to you. First of all, hate speech is defined by people who hear it. Free speech is defined by God. Did you get that? Free speech is a God-given right. Hate speech is determined by the perceptions of the people hearing it. Which do you believe is more important? Hate speech or free speech? Especially since the term hate speech has been turned into a political bludgeon to shut people up. Once again, violating free speech. Mr. Brownstein, your fascism is showing. Just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't make it hate speech. And by the way, extremists, that's another term defined by people. The people, say, for example, with, a job at The Atlantic, can call anybody an extremist. What about the people beating people to death in the streets during BLM riots? Were they extremists? Oh, no. No, those were social justice protesters. Oh, I see. So the murder was for all the right reasons? The arson? The pillage? The actual setting of fire of federal buildings, as opposed to just walking around and saying, my goodness gracious, there's the speaker's gavel. So anyway, the Jewish Voice, a news and opinion site dedicated to promoting classical Judaism, asserted that Don Lemon's continued presence on CNN would ensure most Americans would click off the channel. By the way, before we get away from Brownstein, okay, let's see, hate speech, racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. Let's see, where is that coming from? Racism is coming from the American left. Anti-Semitism is coming from the American left. Homophobia is an archaic term that describes something that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as homophobia. There isn't. Nobody cares. And far-right intimidation? Okay, who's intimidating who? The right or the left? I don't know. Those BLM riots were solely a creature of the left. They were pretty intimidating. Let's see, how ridiculous can it get? I've always said what I want and always will speak from the heart, said Tommy Chong. Yeah, that's true. A tech entrepreneur named Morton Overby A former managing editor of CNN Norway slammed Musk for appearing to flout his own rule to label parody. Just 17 days ago, Musk made up a new rule saying accounts engaged in parody must include parody in their name. He owns the place. He gets to do whatever he wants. Once again, it's not your company. It belongs to Elon Musk. It belongs to Elon Musk because the people that used to own it violated the Constitution of the United States. Let that sink in. This has been the Wells Report. Thanks very much for joining us. If you missed the first hour, good, because I didn't put it up because it sucked. But anyway, see you again tomorrow. Until then, take care. All right. Yeah, I'm glad I got it going too, John. That first hour. I'm like sitting here peacefully minding my own business, getting all ready, getting all excited and so on and so forth. And life is good and I'm having a good time. And then all of a sudden the lights go blink, blink. And I'm going, oh my God. And I had to reconfigure everything. And I had about 3 minutes. It was like, seriously? Man. Let's see. Good show, manana. Thank you very much, Gary. I appreciate it. I'm playing on Thursday. People were hassling me because I didn't give you enough notice. I'm playing on Thursday. Same old place. The Dream Tacos. Come on and see us. We'd love it. All right, so take good care, and I'll see you guys tomorrow, huh? Same bat time, same bat channel.